Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My YouTube channel is Discerning What is True. Today is the 29th day of December 2022. I hope you're having a good day. The weather warmed up quite a bit here where I live in the 60s. So not supposed to be really what I call a cold night tonight. That is compared to what we've had approximately a week ago. So my title tonight is my title of my talk tonight is Tavistock Institute, um, how it affects the human relations. That is Institute of Human Relations, I should say. And we're going to start at chapter 16 tonight, and hopefully go through 17 and 18. This work is by John Coleman, who once worked for Tavistock and decided to leave the organization and to make people aware what truly has been going on for actually almost 100 years now. Actually, it is over 100 years ago because this was started in 1912. So this is 2022, so it's actually 110 years ago. My hope is for you to see how you are controlled or steered in a way that you don't even realize it. Um, those who rule this particular planet um, are able to manipulate you in so many ways that you have no idea what is actually going on, and you actually accept by faith what they're telling you is the truth. But that's far from it. And so we're going to read some good information. I enjoy reading this particular book. It's an excellent book. It took guts for Mr. John Coleman to do this. I don't know if John Coleman is actually alive or not. This work was probably done in the 1990s, as well as I recollect, at the top of my head here. So we're going to continue now with chapter 16, and I hope that there'll be some others to come on tonight, and will appreciate this program, what I'm sharing with you, um, and that we can all learn together. Okay, so this is again, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Chapter 16. The scientific propaganda can deceive the very elect. The vast majority of people in the world today will surely have heard of the Beast of Berlin and how the Allies put to an end to its mad rampage through Europe. Most people in recent times have also heard of the Beast of Baghdad. But how many have heard of the name of Sir Harold Nicolson, a distinguished scholar whose through examination of literal hundreds of thousands of documents from 1912 to 1925 absolutely exonerated Kaiser Wilhelm II from starting World War I? How many people know this? Put it to the test. Try your local talk show whiz and see what happens. Thus, for more than 25 years, the myth of the Kaiser dominated the headlines and had the effect of turning millions of people in Britain and America against Germany. In an unjust, unfortunate byproduct, the vast propaganda machine that has the British people by the throat since it was first opened for business in 1913. I'm sorry, I was wrong by year. We speak of Wellington House and its successor, the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. My point here is to give you a history also of what has transpired, and it is still going on. How the media with the Tavistock has the effect is showing today, in many ways, Russia is the bad boy, you see, Putin is. Um, and that Ukraine, which is in a lot of ways is they're trying to get Ukraine into NATO, um, and with that, it would mean that simply as that the United States would actually and the other countries would actually fight for their supposedly freedom. But I believe it's a ruse. I believe it's a way of actually maybe it could get us in World War III. I hope not, but that's just what I wonder what's going on here. Let's continue here. The amazing thing about the myth is how long it has lasted. But the purpose of propaganda is precisely to perpetrate a myth, a lie, or some piece of misinformation that lives long after the truth is forgotten. Japan will forever be blamed for Pearl Harbor and for the rape of Nanking, and while Churchill will forever be hailed as a great man instead of a brutal warmonger. In the same way, Colin Powell recently visited Iraq and came out with a banner headlining statement about Hussein, that is, gassing the Kurds during the Iraq and Iran war. The truth is that the gas-filled missiles that fell on the Kurdish village were phosgene. I'll spell that for you. Phosgene. Phosgene. A type not possessed by Iraq. But they were in the arsenal of Iran. What happened was that during a Iraqi offensive, the Iranians fired a large number of gas-filled rockets at Iraqi positions, but some fell short among the Kurds along the border. This was confirmed by the U.S. Military College of War report, which entirely exonerated Iraq. Yet, although the accusation was thoroughly refuted in 2005, almost 30 years later, while on a goodwill tour of Malaysia, Karen Hughes, representing President George Bush, repeatedly denied, embellishing it by claiming that 30,000 Kurds had been gassed to death by Saddam Hussein. A member of the audience contested her statement, and the next day Hughes was forced to retract her story, saying that she had misspoken herself. No, that she didn't misspoken herself. She just basically lied. You see, this is what they do. An investigation into the incident revealed that Hughes actually believed the lies she had heard repeatedly over and over again by President Bush, Prime Minister Blair, Secretary of State Colin Powell, and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Now, which ought to tell us a great deal about the power of propaganda. Most people are unaware that Mr. Donald Rumsfeld was actually the one that actually helped Saddam Hussein to come into power. You see. You got to read between the lines here, folks. Okay? The facts of the case reported by the War College were later confirmed by the U.S. Army and by a second U.S. source. Thus, the world knows this. We doubt it. Truth is forgotten truth is forgotten while a lie lives on. Thus, Colin Powell's propaganda against Iraq will go the way of the propaganda against Kaiser Wilhelm II, on and on for more than 100 years, while the truth died the moment the first propaganda blast appeared in the newspapers. In this lies the value of propaganda. You see, it's just saying a lie over and over and over again, and people just believe it. The social sciences at Tavistock know this, and today they can profile any audience to accept lies best suited to their perception without understanding the issues behind it. True. Most are not political science experts. Most are not international affairs or international studies students, you see. That's the key. You see, most are just regular people. They trust their so-called leaders. And it's done on both sides also. So don't think it's always one particular deal here. So let me continue on. By this matter, a morally correct position and a solid backing for the attack on Afghanistan was created. Few of the American people ever raised doubts about whether what their government was doing in Afghanistan, when in accordance with the U.S. Constitution, there was no referendum and no mandate to confirm or deny acceptance by the people of the Bush administration's policy towards Afghanistan. We had a wild man in the office, basically, folks. People really, I live in the South, and I'm not a liberal neither, so I tend to be what I call a libertarian. But they eat up this whole idea of the military here in the South, because most of the military bases are here a lot of military bases are here in the South. And many of these men who live in the South are willing to go and fight so far what I would call spreading freedom, that is fighting communism as it once was, or now fighting madmen, so to speak, and yet they're unaware how much they're being used. That's the reason why the Army has dog tags on the soldiers because that's what they are. That's what they're called. Kissinger made that statement. They're nothing but dogs, you see. So that's why they're called dog tags on. And there'll be people who in the Army would probably say, oh, you're just blowing up smoke. No, I'm not. I'm not. Just look up Henry Kissinger. He talks about this. Confirm it to yourselves. They disdain the military in a lot of ways because simply most of them can't think on their own. So we got all the, anyway, propaganda brainwashing does not call for a mandate. The fact that none of the urgent hijackers of the planes used against the Twin Towers were from Afghanistan was completely lost on the American public. 74% of whom still believe that Al Qaeda did it and that they live in Afghanistan. Same percentage of Americans were brainwashed to believe that Taliban and President Hussein worked together to bring about the tragedy. Wow. The American people do not know that Saddam Hussein would have nothing to do with the Taliban leadership. They were actually enemies, if you understand. Why did the American people allow themselves to be treated in this manner? Why did they allow politicians to lie, cheat, connive, dissemble, prevaricate, obfuscate, and continually deceive them? What we ought to mark well is the way Woodrow Wilson treated the American people like sheep. When asked why he kept a small flock of sheep gazing on the White House lawns, this is unbelievable. Wilson replied, "They remind me of the American people." What a ghastly statement, folks. This was over 100 years ago when a president stating this, that the flock of sheep reminded them of the American people. And probably he's right in some ways, because most people today are not willing to even stand for truth. They just continue to capitulate like sheep. You see. Wilson had a burning ambition to rush America into World War I, and he used Wellington House lies, that is the propaganda against dissenters, the bulk of the people, to persuade them to change their outlook. Roosevelt, that is Franklin, repeated the ploy to get the U.S. into World War II through lies and propaganda, most often than not the same thing, culminating in the success of Pearl Harbor. We saw the same line used by President Clinton in the run-up to and during the unjust war against Serbia. Clinton's entire persuasion consisted of lies and disinformation, not to mention misinformation. No wonder that Rumsfeld pronouncements are always met with suspicion. When asked about the role being played by propaganda, Rumsfeld blatantly replied, "Government officials, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, and the people who work with me tell the American people the truth." Really? Bull crap. So, we'll continue now at chapter 17 with propaganda and psychological warfare. A list of U.S. government papers, some available and some not, reveal in a striking manner just how controlled the nation of the world, that is including the United States, have become due to the exercise of propaganda methods as an astonishing array of levels. At best, I can only mention the titles and paraphrase content because of the vastness of the material. I hope the information we have put together will shock the American people out of their slumbering apathy and make them realize just how far they are on the road to becoming slaves of the socialist New World Order, which is inside the modern world government. Official definitions, a useful collection of terms and definitions as used by a Washington power establishment. Without exception, every single one of the programs cited herein are Tavistock born and bred. Social sciences and political intervention. What passes itself off as a project center development assistance may in reality consist of dangerous manipulation of cultural and social relations in the Southern Hemisphere. Because of the enormous monetary advantage enjoyed by the donors of aid, they are often in a position to do the extension psychosocial studies of target groups and to exploit them in ways that would not occur to most people, even in their worst nightmares. It is typical of everything John Rawlings Rees taught at Tavistock and was carried into every aspect of American life. Shock and awe, achieving rapid dominance. This is the National Defense University text, 1996, that became the theory behind U.S. intervention into Middle East and the war against Iraq in March and April 2003. Shock and awe, says the text, is intended to be the non-nuclear equivalent of the bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki in 1945. Says the now out of print study guide of that terrible tragedy says the impact of these weapons was sufficient to transfer both the mindset of the average Japanese citizen and the outlook of the leadership through this condition of shock and awe. What it is simply is using weapons to basically overwhelm the psyche of the Japanese. That's what it was about, and would basically, in a way, the enemy would be so discouraged that it didn't even pick up the arms to fight. That's the whole idea of what they do. It's a psychological war, a battle, in order to use weapons that seem invincible, and many just simply don't even try to fight back. That's my spiel. The Japanese simply could not comprehend the destructive power carried by a single airplane. This incomprehensive produced a state of awe. Besides using massive firepower for psychological purposes, the publication also includes extensive discussion of propaganda operations. The principal mechanism for achieving this dominance is through imposing sufficient conditions of shock and awe on the adversary to convince or compel it to accept our strategic aims and military objectives, the writer states. Clearly, deception, confusion, misinformation, and disinformation, perhaps in a massive amount, must be employed. The psychological warfare in compact, this is a full text of the infamous shock and awe doctrine, published in 1996 by the National Defense University in Washington. The concept is to gain complete control over the will of an adversary, as well as the perceptions and understanding of target peoples, literally making an enemy impotent to act or react. So a lot of this is also done, as I explained last night a little bit. A lot of times it's not used against what we call industrial centers or something like that, but it's actually used against the people. And it used to be when wars were fought, they were not fought to those who were innocent, that had nothing to do with the war. The way that strategically worked was to fight an army. You never went in to destroy the people, because people have no arms to protect themselves, you see. In fact, it's kind of like a weenie in a lot of ways when you think about it, what we've done. What we did inflict on Germany, in Dresden, in Hamburg, and many other cities that were constantly bombed during World War II, of shock and awe. And literally what happened, there was many firestorms that took place. And that actually these were defenseless people who had no arms to protect themselves, much less a machine gun or whatever to even do anything. These were cities that were actually bombed because there were civilians there. It is worth noting that all of these words and descriptions were found in textbooks used to condition students attending classes conducted by John Rawlins Rees at the British Army Psychological Warfare Bureau, where Rawlins was a master theoretician. Shock and awe doctrine is described as a strategy to achieve the systematic destruction of military capability through attrition, where appropriate, and to use overwhelming force to paralyze, shock, unnerve, and ultimately accomplish the moral destruction of his opponent. International Conference on Population Development, ICPD, a program of action presented at the conference, called for massive propaganda effort, utilizing the mass media, the NGOs, non-government organizations, commercial entertainment, and academic institutions, in effect to persuade people in developing countries to change their fertility preferences. Wow. A revision to the original text added to the accommodated representatives from developing countries urged that communications activities carried out by donors for advocacy purposes or to promote particular lifestyles should be labeled in such a way that the public will be aware of their purpose, and that the identity of sponsors should be indicated in an appropriate manner. Despite this recommendation, which imposes no mandatory restrictions on aid donors, the communication section of the document remains a very dangerous and politically explosive part of the New World Order agenda. The Population Communication Project, the U.S. Agency for International Development, that is USAID, AID, has poured tens of millions of dollars in mass media influence campaign that uses tactics borrowed from military psychological war operatives, that is USAID, is only one of hundreds of U.S. government agencies that contracted with Tavistock to write its programs. In fact, the contractor working as proxy for USAID in this case was also under contract with the U.S. Army to prepare teaching manuals for psychological operations. Enter-educate, using entertainment as propaganda. The young audience is likely to be more vulnerable to messages prescribed in the context of entertainment than to other communications that might tend to raise questions about the legitimacy of foreign ideas. Thus, the entertainment/propaganda approach has become a huge part of USAID international population control efforts. You'll see that simply is about population control efforts here. This is all, again, being done. Here again, literally millions of dollars has gone to Tavistock for programs taught by enter-educate operators. When propaganda backfires, a study done of family planning attitudes and behavior done in north of Nigeria in 1994, according to a published report, the negative reaction illustrates opposition to outside improprieties to family planning in general and to U.S.-sponsored family planning programs in particular. Now, here's what you've got to ask yourself here as you see this. Why is the United States involved in basically telling people what they need to do in order to have kids in Nigeria in 1994? What business does the United States have to do with that? Well, the United States is not really doing this. I mean, they're doing it, but they're doing it on behalf of world government. They're doing it on behalf of decreasing the population. If you noticed that in July of this year, the Georgia Guidestones was destroyed. It basically is a warning. That warning was put up back in the 1980s, you see. And it was allowed to be up for probably, 45 years here, 90 to 25. Yeah, probably 45 years, maybe in that neighborhood. And now it's destroyed. And it was a warning that that was what their plan was. They verbalized it and put it in stone. You see. And what they want is they don't want the population to grow anymore because they have this whole idea, which is a lie, that the more population there is, they will take more and more food. And that's another lie, folks. So this whole idea of population war, bomb, what do you want to call it? And it's not bomb, but the explosion of popular, you hear the negativity of that immensely. And what it means is simply is the minority of the people who actually rule this planet world in some ways are fearful of that because there's billions and billions of people. But yet almost those who rule this planet own probably 95 to 96% of the resources and land. You see. There's plenty of land for people everywhere. No matter who, race, whatever, they can grow their own crops, be self-sufficient. That's all they got to do. But we have a group of people who don't want that to happen. See, they want to control it all. Let me continue on. Nigeria's bilateral population program, the U.S. State Department document, the major planning document of the U.S. government population control strategy for Nigeria, is also used as an important part of propaganda and psychological warfare employed in the U.S. government programs to undermine Latin American political movements, their anti-war efforts, movement, and grassroots political organizations. The contract to write this program was awarded to Tavistock. Postmodern warfare, a menu of resources about political/psychological warfare, covert activities, and genocide. Urban deconcentration and other tactics. This is so diabolical in contact that I do not propose publishing it, at least for now. Social influence, propaganda, and persuasion. Some useful background information. Psychological operations in guerrilla warfare. The CIA tactic manual for paramilitary forces in Central America prepared by Tavistock. The CIA has Tavistock under contract and works very close with them. Institute for Propaganda Analysis, a collection of documents containing basic facts about covert influence campaigns. Here again, the Institute is merely a clearinghouse for Tavistock's data and brainwashing method for mass use. The United States Intelligence Bureau officials' description and duties of U.S. government bureaus involved in the collection of analysis of intelligence. The secretive and government bulletins, that is a collection of documents advocating openness in government. Report collections, a source for reliable research materials on international institutions and their role in fronting for the wealthy, the powerful nations that control their policies. Many of the institutions listed have their leadership cadre taught by Tavistock social scientists. Have you ever wondered why why the northern hemisphere, that is the upper part of the world, the Earth, that is always involved into the southern corridors, that is in South America, quite a bit of Africa, and Australia, and New Zealand, and why there's not only trying to control little brother, so to speak, there, but also the wars are always have been here in the last hundreds of years, have been almost all of them have been in Europe. Almost all of them have been in Europe. It seems to be part of what we call the industrialization of the North. It's the northern part, again, northern hemisphere of the planet. While there's far less of southern in the southern part than what we call industrialized. In fact, the southern part is usually what I would call raped and pillaged. It's where a lot of the minerals are, the gold, diamonds are, all types of metals in southern Africa, parts of uranium, other metals that are found in certain parts of South America. So is Australia. Propaganda, dissemination of ideas and information for the purpose of inducing or intensifying specific attitudes and actions, because propaganda is frequently accompanied by distortion of facts and by appeal to passion and prejudice. It is often thought to be invariably false or misleading. As Tavistock manuals state, the essential distinctive lies in the intentions of the propagandist to persuade the audience to adopt the attitudes or actions he or she espouses. Wilson and Roosevelt were examples of this truism, both having been polished in the art of diplomacy by deception, as Buchanan explained the term back in 1814. And I meant to spell that for you. That's B-U-K-A-N-I-N. Now to chapter 18. Now, John Coleman here is continuing re-emphasizing what is taking place, because a lot of times simply is most people don't get it. And so he continues to emphasize Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson is the catalyst that actually starts all this and why we've been involved in world wars. Okay? Why the United States got involved in Europe makes no sense, period. Let them fight it out, whatever they want to. Stay out of the war. Not only the First War, but the Second World War. And yet they found a way to get us into the war. The massive modern propaganda techniques which have become a familiar part of particularly the American and British government began with World War I from 1914 to 1918. From the beginning of the war, both Germany and British propagandists worked hard to win sympathy and support of the United States. German propagandists appealed to the many Americans of German descent and to those of Irish descent who were traditionally hostile to Great Britain, who was living in America. The propaganda was rather crude by today's standard, but what it lacked finesse was made up by the sheer volume of the huge output that was put out by the Wellington House. Soon, however, Germany was virtually cut off from direct access to the United States. Thereafter, British propaganda had little competition in the United States, and it was conducted more skillfully than that of the Germans, who had no equivalent of Wellington House, Bernays, or Lippmann. It's important that you understand something here. I was going to point out that the United States entered the war based upon Japan in World War II, and then actually declared Germany also at war, even though Germany never attacked the United States. They did this in a way very. I can understand the rationale with Japan, but why would the United States do this? Because the United States is a little brother to Britain. They pull us around all the time, and we go and do what Britain tells us to do. That's what goes on. So why would you want to be? I guess basically simply is the concept of even this, that Britain has allowed this to happen to allow people in America to think themselves to be free, when in reality, Britain has always controlled our politics. Has controlled us immensely. But it's not obvious to those who see. But if you look into it, you'll see that actually the United States is always involved. If you remember the war that took place in the Falklands, the United States provided help for Britain. And what on earth for, I'll never know. Argentina claimed those islands to be theirs, and I'm not going to go into that whole part, such and such. But that war itself, you can see the realization simply is that Britain itself was no longer a major industrial power, but also was no longer a major military power. You see. Yes, it did beat Argentina. Yes, I understand that. But they had to have help, because Ronald Reagan supported that, gave them help in many ways. And it tells you again this whole dynamic that the United States is really not that free from Britain's manipulation of us, or even their propaganda on us. You see. Once engaged in the war, Woodrow Wilson organized the Committee on Public Information, an official propaganda agency, to mobilize American public opinion. This committee proved highly successful, particularly in the sale of Liberty bonds, and no wonder. This program was written for the White House by Tavistock and was largely directed from London. The exploitation by the allies of President Wilson, that is Wilson's 14 points, which seemed to promise a just peace for both the victors and the vanquished, contributed greatly towards crystallizing opposition within the Central Powers to continuation of the war. Elsewhere herein we have the details of the lies and distortions engaged in by the Bryce Commission, which remains one of the most disturbing examples of blatant lying successfully passed off as true. The part played by Americans at Wellington House, the premier propaganda center in the world at that time, is also explained later herein. Propaganda aspects of World War II were similar to those of World War I, except for that it was the Second World War, also started by Britain and financed by the international bankers, was greatly in scope. Radio played a major role with news broadcasts, always a mixture of facts heavily laced with fiction. Propaganda activities overseas were more intense. The Tavistock Institute was able to put into practice all the valuable lessons it had learned from 1914 to 1919, and he used its experience in a number of new ways in the old as well as in new countries. Both Germany and the United Kingdom again sought to sway American opinion. German propagandists played on anti-British sentiment, presented the war as a struggle against communism, and pictured Germany as the invincible champion of a new wave of anti-communism. Most people are unaware of this, so I'm going to tell you this. The United States, when they decided to choose what language they were going to speak, Germany failed by one vote. That's how many people here are of German descent. It almost became a German, not colony, but we almost came to the point of speaking German. Most are not even aware of that. They don't tell you that in school. You see. And pictured Germany as the invincible champion of a new wave of anti-communism. German agents also gave their support to movements in the United States that backed isolationism, a description tag attached to all Americans who opposed war with Germany. German propaganda efforts were no match against the expertise of Wellington House and Tavistock or the resources of Britain, secretly aided with huge amounts of money by the Roosevelt administration. And once again, it proved ineffective. That is, the Germans. The carefully planned attack on Pearl Harbor was well known by Roosevelt, Stimson, and Knox for months before the actual attack. December 1941 was a godsend for Roosevelt, who had been trying desperately to force the U.S. to go to war on the side of Britain, especially after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. American people were persuaded by propaganda and outright lies that Germany was the aggressor. The dire warnings by Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, and numbers of other anti-war senators that Roosevelt was not to be trusted, and that as was the case in World War I, the U.S. had no business interjecting itself into a war in Germany, was blunted by propaganda. Also, the contrived situation at Pearl Harbor changed public opinion, as Roosevelt well knew it would. Allied propaganda efforts that flowed from Tavistock were aimed at separating the people of the Axis nations from their government, which were held solely to blame for the war. Radio broadcasters and leaflets dropped from the air carried Allied propaganda to the enemy. The official U.S. propaganda agency during World War II were the Office of War Information, OWI, charged with disseminating Tavistock information at home and abroad, and the Office of Strategic Services, forerunner of the CIA and the creation of Tavistock, charged with conducting psychological warfare against the enemy. And what I'm trying to explain to you and all this thing about wars here and what he's talking about, that is John Coleman, is that it still is used today on us, and it's not even in a wartime situation. There's psychological warfare going on continuously now in our country. But it's even before even the whole thing with Ukraine. It's always been a form of psychological war with people here. It's also, when you think about it, particularly in areas of what we call how many military bases does the United States have throughout the world? I think there are approximately 300 of them. What on earth for? Well, we're told that basically we're protecting the sea lanes. That's what we were told very young when I was in high school. Really? We need that many bases in the world? No. Has nothing to do with that. It is basically there to threaten any country who basically decides to do their own thing. In other words, if you don't go along with us, we will do something to you. Okay? That's what's going on. It's been going on. So our military does this. And those who are normal soldiers in this type of thing don't even know this, you see, because that's been kept away from them. They're just told that to fight and die or something that really has, of any value, you see. As supreme headquarters in the European theater of operation, the OWI and OSS were coordinated with military activities by the Psychological Warfare Division under the direction of social science from Tavistock Institute. And what I want to tell you this here is also, the whole idea of psychology was to study, back in the 1860s, was to find out what was man like, not outside of himself, but actually inside himself. And what's happened with Tavistock, the Frankfurt School, is they have discovered the weaknesses of people, and they've used it against us. that they have not used it to help us, but they've used it against us in order to control us. Or don't speak out. Don't read books like I'm reading to you, see, because that would cause a problem, you see. So in reality, they discovered what they discovered about man. In many ways, he's fearful and that he has a hard time standing up and against evil. And most people don't speak out. They simply go along with the plan because they're fearful of death. Let's continue. In the period of the Cold War, a marked conflict of interest between the United States and the Soviet Union followed World War II. Propaganda continued to be a significant instrument of national policy. What they did here, folks, this whole Cold War scenario was to continue the military operations, the buildup of defense that actually the government was paying for taxes, and they were building all these super type of weapons, so to speak, to protect us from the Soviet Union in case there would be a nuclear war. And a lot of it simply was to benefit the people who made the arms, that made airplanes, that made tanks, that made all this stuff. And so we were not supposed to be what we are today. The United States is always on alert. We used to not even have it, only a very small army at one time. And now it's a vast array of that. Millions upon millions of men ready to fight. And so they've kept us in this whole idea of fear of nuclear war or fear of war itself. And so we go in these other countries to put down their so-called revolutions when in reality, most of the time, they simply just want to be free. You see? Both the Democratic and Communist blocs of states attempt by sustained campaigns to win to their side the great masses of uncommitted people and thereby achieve their objectives without resorting to armed conflict. Every aspect of national life and policy was exploited for purposes of propaganda. The Cold War was also marked by use of defectors, trials, and confessions for propaganda purposes. In this propaganda war, the communist nations seemed initially to have a distinct advantage because their governments controlled all media. They could largely sealed off their people from Western propaganda. At the same time, the highly centralized government could plan elaborate propaganda campaigns and mobilize resources to carry out their plans. They could also count on and from communist parties and sympathizers in other countries. Democratic states, on the other hand, could neither prevent their people from being exposed to communist propaganda nor mobilize all their resources to counter it. This apparent advantage for communist governments eroded during the 1980s as communication technology advanced. Inability to control the spread of information was a major factor in disintegration, the disintegration of many communist regimes in Eastern Europe at the end of the decade. The United States Information Agency, the USIA, established in 1953 to conduct propaganda and cultural activities abroad. And this is what they call the Voice of America. This is a way of a radio network pretty much used during World War II, and not here in the United States was not used at that point. That is in World War II. I mean, it was in World War II, but not in First World War. The technology was not yet there. And the BBC that carried news and information about the United States in more than 40 languages in all parts of the world. It's actually done through shortwave radio. And the main power now is Voice of America is no longer what it used to be in the last 20 years or so, because basically the internet is taking over. But in a situation that most people are aware of, the Chinese have been very prolific in their programming with doing shortwave radio. That's not in here. I'm just giving you some information here. So that's the conclusion of these chapters here tonight. I wanted to just basically share this with you, and hopefully you will be enlightened by all this information. It probably overwhelms you in some ways, but you really need to be aware of that. Tavistock indeed is a propaganda arm by the British and is used in many ways to um, that we don't have our bearings. We don't really know what's going on. We most of the time don't even know what's going on in Ukraine, folks. And yet our government is continually sending military hardware and some of our best weaponry to a country that's not even a member of NATO. Are you aware of that? No, I don't think people are aware of that. And there's no way Ukraine could even pay back this stuff, you see. How can they pay it back, you see? And then recently I heard that basically Italy sent some of their up-to-date type of weaponry also. Um, it's gradually widening into maybe a war because many countries here, I mean, NATO countries, are sending their weapons to Ukraine. But I believe simply it will lead maybe to an all-out war. And we have U.S. troops already in that country, Ukraine, claiming that basically we want to make sure that the weapons we give them that goes to them, which is an excuse to get themselves in that country and to get themselves more and more bogged down, just like we did in Vietnam, and it became a quagmire. And the sad part simply is people don't understand this. Simply is the United States is no longer the military, sorry, not the industrial power it was back in the 60s. You know, a lot of the boots that are actually the Army wears is made in China. In fact, I'm pretty sure that even the uniforms are all made in China. We don't make that anymore. What the hell are we doing? You see. So I appreciate your attention, and I wish you a good night, and you take care. Thank you.